It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Nadya Williams, and we're going to be discussing her brand new book, Cultural Christians in the Early Church, a historical and practical introduction to Christians in the Greco-Roman World. Nadya, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, truly my pleasure to get to meet you. I know for much of my audience, this is the very first time they are encountering you. So we're going to kick this off by having you share a bit of the Nadya Williams origin story. So for all of us, we're meeting you for the first time. What do we need to know about you?
So if you're hearing a little bit of an accent or a lot of an accent, I was born in the Soviet Union back when it existed. And in 1991, right before it collapsed, my family immigrated to Israel. So I grew up in a secular Jewish home. Then in 96, right as I was about to start 10th grade, my family moved to the US. And we've been here ever since. So I got a PhD in classics from Princeton University. I taught at different state universities for 15 years, and now I'm a homeschool mom, and I write books. And I came to Christ at age 30. That's important.
Much respect for being a homeschool mom that writes books. My wife and I have 10 kids, as most of you who listen to the show know, and we homeschooled for much of our whole life at home with our kids due to circumstances I'm not going to talk about. We do have some kids in the school at our church now, but we very much are familiar with the homeschool lifestyle. It keeps you busy, to say the least. I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn for a moment in terms of your upbringing and just all the changes you went through being immersed in different cultural situations. Talk to us a little bit about how your personal life experiences maybe gave you a background to step into a book like this. And you get into that a little bit in the opening part of the book, but it's a fascinating aspect of your story.
Yeah, it's a reminder that God works with what He has, like with our lives and life stories. So, as a classicist, somebody who was immersed in the study of the Greco-Roman world and the languages, when I first came to Christ, it was just such a joy to read God's word in Greek. So, and I still do most of my New Testament reading in Greek. It forces me to slow down, really pay attention, and just delight in it. But I think about it, how God has a sense of humor, that here I am, a trained ancient historian. And as I've joked to friends before, it's kind of occupational hazard that all of that training brought me to Christ.
And in terms of the story behind the book, was there a particular issue you saw? Was there a question you wanted to answer? What steered you down the path of this project? Because it's a pretty substantial book. It's not short, so this is a significant investment of time, research, all the things. So, what was the spark that got this started?
It was conversations over the years, both with people at church, but also my students at the time at the time I was teaching in the Bible Belt in Georgia. And a lot of my students, just like fellow churchgoers, had this impression of early Christians as much better than we are. Like we really need to get back to the early church. They were doing things right. We're not. And I was thinking like, well, I could like come up with a list. And in fact, I started keeping a list of all the problems, all the really bad Christians in the New Testament. And then I realized, you know what? There is a common element. So a few months into like thinking about this project, it clicked in my head that the common element to these misbehaving Christians in the New Testament was cultural sin. That here are people who are trying so hard to follow Jesus. They're not just being, problematic. They're not misbehaving necessarily on purpose. I mean, sometimes maybe, but a lot of times what leads them astray is thinking, well, everybody around me does X or Y. So why shouldn't I? What's the problem? And realizing that following Christ is always going to be countercultural, which is always going to be so difficult because it's a lot more difficult to swim against the tide.
And if you're really paying attention, she just offered a really great book title. all the really bad Christians in the New Testament. Obviously, there have been lots of variations of kind of sensational book titles, but hey, that could be an interesting place to start brainstorming at least. And for some people who might not quite grasp the concept, when we say um, cultural Christian, like what do you mean like that? Like, what are the boundaries there? Because I think we hear that thrown around a lot, but I don't know if people necessarily always know how to define that.
That's a good question, and, I do try to define that in the book. So, what I have in mind is the people who go to church most Sundays, and then the rest of the week, they don't necessarily quite think about, um, Jesus and, like, following Christ as determining their decisions. So, you might make decisions about finances, dating, relationships, how you raise your children, and so on and so forth, what you do for entertainment, and you're not necessarily thinking about, your Christian walk in connection with that. You do that just on Sundays. So that compartmentalization, there's that, like, 50-cent word, that, is so comfortable and convenient in modern day America. And we think of it as an American thing, and perhaps modern day America makes it extra easy. But what I'm arguing is this was just as easy to do in the Roman world because, again, you're surrounded by this other culture all around you. So, yes, you go to church and that's important to you, but there are all these other things, and that's the cultural Christians. If you ask them, like, what are you? They will proudly tell you, we are believers, we follow Christ. And indeed, you look at the polls today, all those Gallup polls of people who say we're Christians, but we also believe in like all these other things. And you're thinking, wait a second, how did that happen? Well, that's how it happened.
Well, and I just think of broader friends, acquaintances, family context too. Most of the people that I know in my circles would say that they're a Christian, but if you ask them, well, when was the last time you go to church or you went to church? Some of them would say, well, I Christmas and Easter, or some would say, Uncle Joe's funeral 3 years ago. I mean, people have all kinds of definitions of what it means to be a Christian. And church attendance is one aspect. Let alone how that's impacting what it looks like for you to live out your faith, so to speak, in the day to day. Let's jump into some of the ground you cover in the first part of the book. Talk to us a little bit about sharing without caring, and from your perspective, what's going on with Ananias and Sapphira. That was super eye opening because I think we just get stuck in the mechanics of the story and don't quite have enough of the cultural context to see what was actually going on there. That was very fascinating to me.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed delving into that particular story. So, Ananias and Sapphira, we get their story pretty early on in Acts. They decide to sell some property and donate some of the proceedings to the church. They lie, though, and they say, well, we've donated everything, even though they only give a part. And so the question is, what's going on? And by the way, they get struck dead on the spot by the Holy Spirit, which is kind of unusual, doesn't happen to like everybody who misbehaves. So there are a lot of like red flags with the story that something unusual is going on here and we need to pay attention. And my argument is if you look at attitudes toward property in the Greco Roman world, it really makes sense. So the idea of benefactors was very much ingrained in Greek and Roman cities. The benefactor is somebody wealthy who donates some money to the city to like build a building or improve a building. And you always expect a sort of quid pro quo. Well, here I am. I donated something. So you better like put up a statue to me or honor me in some kind of public way. And we have hints here that they really wanted to be recognized in that typical like Greco-Roman way as heroes by their early church community. And so that's their motivation. And that's the whole problem with like their hearts were not in the right place, which is really striking. Like God's expectation of holiness in our intent. And the response in Acts that the others in the church look at that and they were afraid. Why? Because, I mean, we all should be afraid. Like, our hearts are not in the right place.
Well, and I think if I remember correctly from the book, the textual context is basically they were stealing from God. Was kind of how it came across, correct?
Yes. Yeah, there are echoes to the story of Achan from the Old Testament there as well. So just the whole idea of uh, they're thinking so, like, complete disconnect what they think they're doing and what is actually happening theologically, and they're being held accountable to it.
Well, next, let's get into some of the challenges Jewish Christians would have faced in terms of, when it came to food. You've got the Jewish dietary laws. You're probably trying to avoid food that's been sacrificed to idols. You don't want to cause a brother to sin. All the things. How do you balance? Like, how do you even decide where to get a meal, let alone not offend God, not offend your brothers and sisters in Christ? What's going on there?
Yeah, so we see a lot of those like moving parts in what Paul is writing about. So Paul himself, of course, combines all of those different issues. He is uh, a Jew, but he's a Christian and he's a Roman citizen, and so he seems to be uniquely aware of all of those problems. And in Corinth, it seems like this is something that came in very handy in talking to the Corinthian Christians. So we have to keep in mind in the ancient cities, uh, keeping kosher would have been difficult, especially because most people in the ancient world, if you're living in a city, you would have any meat. You can pretty much guarantee that any meat you bought in the city probably came like was leftovers from a sacrifice. So for a lot of Jews living in a cosmopolitan Roman city, your best bet was probably something like the Daniel diet, if you will. And uh, so Paul is trying to navigate like this, like what do you tell these people? But at the same time, how do you not make an idol out of your personal holiness as well? And that's where the vision that Peter gets in Acts is so striking, where it's like God tells him, it's like, it's okay, you can eat anything. And that makes it possible for him to go and visit with Gentiles, Gentile converts, preach God's word. Because also, the other kicker is any social occasion in the ancient world, just like today, if you invite somebody to your home, you're going to offer them food. Well, what if they can't eat that food? This is an insult. It would have been an insult for somebody to walk into another person's home to preach the gospel and then, if offered food, to say, sorry, your food is unclean, so I just can't like break well, not bread, but, partake of like cheese and meat with you. That's just too bad. So we see this like working together to break down cultural expectations in a way that's not easy for all of those different groups to make them realize that the gospel is higher than this. It's put relationships first. And that becomes kind of that big theme. It's about relationship that is built over food, including ultimately the Lord's Supper.
Next, let's jump into Greco-Roman culture views of sexuality. I think when people get exposed to some of this, they're like, I don't know what to do with all this. But in terms of that culture, what was considered acceptable, what were some of the challenges that Christians faced in trying to live out their faith and avoiding the things that were just fine, so to speak?
Yeah, one of the most shocking, perhaps, that we encounter again in First Corinthians. That letter goes. There are a lot of bad Christians in Corinth. Uh, well, but God works through that church, right? Just like He works through so many other bad churches, if you will, in quotation marks. But what we see is the accepted attitude in the Greco-Roman world that prostitutes are perfectly fine. Like, it's cheap, easy entertainment. There's no stigma or any like negative connotation necessarily attached to it in the Greco-Roman world. And it seems like a lot of Corinthian Christians just kind of took it with them to the faith, which is really shocking to Paul. And he has to try and explain to them theologically, like, here is why this is wrong. Yes, everybody around you is doing it. No, you should not be doing it. So we get this kind of idea, it's especially outrageous to Paul because he clearly, like reading between the lines, the subtext, he's clearly thinking like you should have figured this out, and they did not, which is not just about sexual immorality. I think it's really a story again about the blinders that we have with cultural sins. Anything around us that is culturally accepted, it's really difficult to say well, it's culturally accepted, but I shouldn't do this because Christ tells me not to. It's a lot easier to say, well, it's culturally accepted. Everyone is doing it. And that perhaps is the challenge that we have with like our own blinders. That's something I'm really trying to get to in this book. And I'm sure I have my own. Every society, every culture, our unique background gives us our own blinders.
And I think that's going to be one of the really insightful things for people as they're going through the book is how much they're going to see themselves in the stories and the different accounts that you're sharing. Because in the same way that folks in that Greco-Roman culture would have struggled with, well, everybody's sitting in this way, it's fine. We also have kind of our pet sins, things we don't want to give up, or we all will compartmentalize off this part or that part of our life, and we're like, yeah, I don't quite want to let the gospel in the light of Jesus. Into that space just yet. I mean, it's part of our ongoing sanctification process. As we let Jesus into more of our things, his light will shine in those areas. But in the same way that culture needed to yield, we have that same challenge as well. Let's jump into a topic from the second part of the book now. The problem of self care in an age of crisis. This was really intriguing. Where you talked about people were actually to some extent avoiding caring for the sick. There was a plague going on because they wanted to preserve themselves for the noble death of dying like a martyr. I was like, man, how do I even get so I'm not going to help these really sick people because I want to die in this way because it gets me more accolades and more attention. What a weird thing to wrestle with.
Well, it seems weird to us because we don't live by the Homeric code. But in the ancient world, that would have been exactly like the instinct. The joke among classicists is to understand anything in the ancient world, you have to go back to Homer, the Homeric epics, like think heroes, Trojan War. Well, and that's exactly the Homeric code. Die a heroic death because then your memory will live forever. And that's such a Homeric ideal that we see reflected over 1,000 years later in these wannabe martyrs in Cyprian's church in the mid third century. These people who say, I want to be in control of this. But it's also a familiar kind of thing to us because all of us have control issues. Like we want to dictate, like, how am I going to serve God? Well, here's a list of ways that I would like to serve God. Please don't ask me to serve in ways that are not on my list. And that really gets into that even today. Like, what are the areas where everybody is eager to volunteer at church? And what are the areas where people say, like, oh, don't ask me to do that?
Well, let's jump now into a couple of topics from the third part of the book. You talk about how Christians in the twilight of the Roman Empire, as things are falling apart, they're really wrestling with, well, what does this mean? What do we, is this God's favor being pulled out? What's going on here? Talk to us about that, and then the challenges we see with Christian nationalism, which is a topic lots of us has been written about it in the past 3 years. That's going to come up a ton as we head into this election season. So something you're going to want to be informed on, and it means different things to different people depending on which kind of camp that you're operating in. All side information for this question. We're not going to answer all that, but what can we learn from those Roman Christians that were wrestling with the fall of an empire?
It's a really difficult question, and Augustine wrestles with it and provides us a really useful guide in wrestling with it theologically. So in 410 AD, the city of Rome was sacked by the Goths, and it's the first time in centuries that anything of this magnitude, a disaster of this magnitude, happened to the city of Rome. And we have to remember that up until that point, Christianity had always existed in the context of the Roman Empire. So for Roman Christians, the idea of the empire, God's favor for the empire, and God's favor for them were synonymous. It was just like the assumption, the air you breathe. Just like for a lot of Americans today, it seems natural to think, well, the Puritans came here. God allowed this country to prosper. So, like, clearly all of these things work together. And what we see from Augustine is it is good and fine and appropriate to love your country. You should love God more. And also, you shouldn't think of anything awful that happens on this earth as a sign of God's favor being pulled away from you. Which, by the way, is a really classic pagan way of thinking that the gods are punishing us for something. And that's not, I mean, we also see that in the Old Testament as well in concrete ways. But what Augustine reminds us is your true city, your true home is not here. So if you think about disasters here on earth, whether political or military or, plagues, whatever else, if you think about it from your perspective as a Christian, the theological truth that prevails is this is not the end of the story. The story does not end here.
And let's jump into one more theme from that latter part of the book. Talk to us about why running away from the church cannot solve our problems, our tendency towards cultural sins. I mean, these are the kind of the early forms of monasticism. You had hermits, monks, nuns, that kind of thing. And again, in my extended family, I have a great aunt who's in her 90s now, who is a cloistered nun, which means she's only left her convent for pretty much doctor's appointments, and she's been there, I think, since she was, like, 30, and so just something crazy to think about, but kind of, to me, that's sort of a modern equivalent of really completely setting yourself apart from society. I don't think she's going for some of the maybe spectacle aspects of of what some of the people you give us examples of, were going for, but, what do we do with these crazy excesses of living on pillars and whatnot? It's very interesting to say the least.
Well, it all starts with a question of like if there are all these sinful people that whose stories I tell in the rest of the book, maybe it would be better for somebody who wants to be truly holy just to withdraw from the church, withdraw from society, leave all those sinners behind. And then you can be truly holy all on your own. And my answer is not so fast. What's fascinating with the stories of a lot of these hermits and holy people is that they still wrestled with sin. Even after 20 years alone, like we hear somebody talking about, like, I've been alone for 20 years and I still struggle with anger. So I think it's a reminder, it's a really humbling reminder that wherever we go, we take our own cultural sins with us. So instead of trying to withdraw from society, my exhortation is just serve harder. It's That's what it is, and it's really sanctifying when you think about it. So, like for instance, the requirements for elders in Timothy and Titus, the idea that you have to be a husband and a father. Well, what happens? Sean, you probably could answer this story. What happens if you're a husband and a father? Well, you're constantly being convicted of your own sinfulness because you have to serve the needs of other really sinful people every single day regardless of whether you're tired, sick, you could be throwing up, you're still serving other people who are probably also throwing up on you. So, like, there's nothing like living in community and family and so on with other people. Whether you're married or not, like, be in a situation where you can serve because that is where sanctification happens. But that is also how the early churches grew because in a world in the Roman Empire where there was no network of care. There was no idea that people are precious and priceless. It was easier to be selfish. Whereas for us, we have this reminder that like we are all made in the image of God. And this means even though we're sinful and fallen, uh, getting into all of that theological nature of us post fall, it's still what makes us grow in our faith walk is going to be being with other really sinful people and serving.
And I'll say too, just in terms of if you'll spend time reading some of the more mystical authors through the centuries who, were living in set apart situations, convents, whatnot, or maybe even living in a cave, a lot of those writers will even talk about how they feel like the devil was tormenting them or demons were tormenting them. So even if they were avoiding people, they're still having spiritual challenges that they're writing about. I think sometimes you could take those very literally. I think in other circumstances, maybe they were putting some skin on the skeleton of the sins and things that they were facing, temptation, anger, whatever it might be. But you read some of those types of authors, and you're going to get an even bigger sense of the sorts of things people who were living a set apart holy life were wrestling with and were struggling with. In terms of modern contemporary parallels, kind of like again maybe even getting back to why you wrote the book. As we look at the cultural landscape of today, where are some of the places we could really start to apply some of the themes, some of the lessons you're trying to bring across in the book?
It's all about the local church. Find ways to serve, to love others, and just like be plugged in. Don't be a disengaged Christian because I think a lot of times cultural Christians are the ones who place themselves first, which is, again, our nature. This is so easy. It's funny. I remember a few years ago talking to another really exhausted mom as we were like sitting in church holding our infants and saying, I'm so tempted to just like it would be so tempting to go into the desert for a few days. It would be such a welcome retreat, and we just kinda laughed about it. But that's the temptation. It's just this idol of self-care. And on the other hand, like, yes, exhausted moms or exhausted anybody needs space to grow, and there is such a thing as just, like, your cup overflowing, in a bad way. But, at the same time, we also are called to serve. And the local church is really, really important in this area.
And my next question, I'm not necessarily expecting you to have all the answers for this, but I think this is something we need to be wrestling with. In terms like immigration's a big issue in the news, racial tensions another big issue. These are things that are coming up in the news. They're going to come up throughout the pre-election conversations. A lot of us were uncomfortable with these themes. We don't want to look at these themes. Why do we need to keep wrestling with? Well, in this circumstance, how what do I do as a Christian? Because we can try to ignore it, but these things are not going away. So we head in the ground, or do we proactively try to figure out how we can be part of a solution?
I think I guess I have 2 thoughts in response. One is, let's not be the Roman Empire. So in the Roman Empire, the idea was because people are ranked by hierarchy, like if you're valuable, if you're, a certain like socioeconomic class and so on. If you're important, your life matters. If you're not important, who cares if you die? Let's not be like that. We have a much better anthropology. Again, if we remember that every single human being, every single human life is precious because made in God's image, that calls us to action. But I guess the second point that I want to make in connection with that is again local. I mean, I'm a homeschooling mom. Like, I'm not going to go on, I don't know, a mission trip serving somewhere like in the war zone, rescuing, I don't know. Like, I can't do these things. The point is serve somewhere local and be part of a solution where you are. The local church can love big. And we see that in the history of the early church. It is precisely by reaching out to others, to other neighbors, that the Roman Empire was transformed by this like crazy little movement of random people who thought they should love everybody.
And I think that's where a lot of us find the difficulties. We're like, well, what does little old me do? And again, with all the responsibilities of your family and your job, all the things. If any of you listening or watching caught my chat with David Fitch last week, he talked about just go where there are hurting people in your community. We all know where those places are. His example, only time we've recommended going to a bar at the end of a podcast episode, but he talked about he has a bar in his neighborhood that he'll go hang out in and read a book. And he's like, man, I have some of the most interesting conversations, and I encounter plenty of hurting people because there's lots of hurting people in that space. So, where are there? I mean, but there's also hurting people in your church. There's hurting people everywhere, and I think some of it is just having the eye, not only the eyes to see, but also being willing to step into whatever that situation is. And it's, I always say it's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you time. It may cost you money. It's going to cost intentionality on your part, and so is if that person is valuable and precious to God, are they not worth you investing in them in some way? And again, that's always a I think every time we enter into those situations, it can be a challenge because again, it is taking away from your day to day and what you normally do. In terms of, and you may have kind of already answered this question, but we'll ask it anyways. In terms of reader takeaway, somebody spends the time, they get to that back flap, kind of, you know, hey, if you read the book, don't miss this one theme. This is a takeaway you absolutely have to discover in the book. So, what do you think that is?
The stories you're reading in the book, they're your story. They're part of your story too. I mean, as Christians, we're kind of connected with our historical spiritual DNA to Christians in the early church. But it's also a reminder that you you probably are, the bad news. The bad news, you're a cultural Christian, just like people in the early church. And the good news is you're just like people in the early.
Yeah, I was telling Nadia before the interview, I could kind of see myself in some of the different stories and accounts that were in the book, and parts of it just made me uncomfortable because it forced me to start wrestling with some of the themes and issues that are in my own world, much as the Greco-Roman Christians and people through the centuries were challenged with as well. If there's anything that never changes, it's that people are people, and history tends to repeat itself. So and I feel like that's something we don't do as well in our contemporary culture. Like we always kind of look to our peers to answer questions. And I'm like, man, start reading some dead authors, people who lived a life and dealt like nothing's new under the sun. Yes, we have different technology and circumstances are different and whatnot, but by and large, we're dealing with the same frustrating things that everybody since the beginning of time has been dealing with. So there's some wisdom to be gleaned in reading this kind of a book, reading the dead authors, if you will. So, maybe you don't need a self-help book. Go check somebody out earlier in history. You might find something fruitful there. Nadia, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about this book, all the things, where do we discover you on the web?
My Substack could be a good place to start, and we just started a slow read through the book there, so anybody can jump in. It's free. Just kind of hop on, read the questions that I post each week, and decide whether to engage or, add your own thoughts.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to Nadia's Substack, as well as links to where you can pick up your very own copy of this brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Nadya Williams. Once again, our book today was Cultural Christians in the Early Church, a historical and practical introduction to Christians in the Greco-Roman world. And Nadya, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. Privilege all mine.